International. Conservation International, which was founded in 1987, is one of the world's largest international nonprofit private conservation organizations focused on the protection of biodiversity and the maintenance of human livelihoods in the context of biodiversity conservation. Will began life as an undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin, majoring in computer engineering. However, along the way, he chose to follow a path that was more ecological than a computer engineering degree might allow. And so he then went on to get his doctorate at the University of Arizona, working with Mike Rosenzweig. And as part of that doctoral work, really exploring the ecology of urban bird communities, but also pioneering the notion of citizen science, using the public to help gather data in a very innovative way that preceded so much of the current citizen science programs of institutions like Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Upon completing his doctorate, Will was a postdoctoral researcher in the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy program here at Princeton University, where he combined both his ecological expertise and his computer engineering skills to undertake a study of conservation prioritization in one of the hottest hotspots of threatened biodiversity in the United States and indeed the world, which is a discrete ecosystem in central Florida called the Lake Wales Ridge that is chock full of rare plants and animals, but has been largely converted to agriculture, orange production, and residential development. Following his time at Princeton, Will moved to Conservation International, where he very quickly rose through the ranks to his present position. In addition to working with the senior leadership at CI to develop the organization's mission and objectives, Will's research interests center on the very interesting and challenging question of where the commonalities are between traditional conservation measures aimed at securing biodiversity and the maintenance of human welfare and well-being. In other words, where are the opportunities to enhance conservation in a way that is beneficial to both biodiversity and to human well-being? Where are there situations where that cannot readily be done? And how should all of that work proceed in a scientifically valid manner within the construct of a conservation organization? With that background, I want to say it's a real pleasure to welcome, I think, one of the leading conservation scientists today, as well as a personal friend and a real visionary in terms of how we look at these issues. Will Turner.
Thanks very much, David. So is there a way to get the lights dimmed a little bit on the slides? So you'll notice my title today is anybody having trouble hearing me? Okay. My title today has not one but two question marks in it. And in science, I don't know, some scientists tend to have a problem with question marks. There are many journals that you can't put question marks in your title, but I deliberately left question marks in mine because I'm one, I think this is a very important question, but more important than that, I'm really excited to be back here at Princeton, where this program in particular, the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy program, is full of people who really like to ask questions and have a lot of creative and interdisciplinary ways of answering them. So by the end of our time here today, I hope to have convinced you that this is an important question, that there are some things that we can say about it, but perhaps more important to enlist your thinking in helping to think about it and address it. So at Conservation International, we've got a saying, people need nature to thrive. And this reflects a few things. One is that nature has to thrive. We share this planet with thousands, millions of amazing species that each have intrinsic value in their own, perhaps right to exist and continue to exist. But a big part of that is that people need nature. Whether it's the forests and other ecosystems that store carbon and help regulate our climate, the water, oceans and rivers that support us with fisheries, the wildlands that are the sources of our inspiration and of our medicines. Just this last year, my own father was hospitalized with a life-threatening illness, one of these multiple drug-resistant bacterial infections. And I was sitting there in the hospital room with him, and he was in a pretty bad state, and I looked up at the IV bag and it read vancomycin, which is one of our antibiotics of last resort for such cases. And his life was saved by taking this antibiotic. Well, it was discovered originally in the soil in Borneo, in the rainforest. So people need nature, and that's not just some people somewhere, but really all of us. But we're currently on a path where nature, our natural capital, is being depleted rapidly. Forests that formerly harbored many unique species and stored carbon are now flattened. Lakes where endemic fish once swam, or rivers that provided water for crops now lie dry. And coastal marine ecosystems like mangroves that once served as nurseries for coral reef species or reduced the impacts of storm surges to human communities have been replaced with things like shrimp farms or other development that's unable to support biodiversity or to buffer lives from poverty from extreme weather. The global extent of these challenges is more and more evident. If you just looked at the newspapers, the headlines for 1 week in January, this is actually a single day in January, you would have seen scientists issue major reports about the state of our oceans, showing that marine biodiversity continues to be under enormously increasing threat. You would have heard that sea level rise is accelerating. We've heard that we've approached or entered what scientists consider to be the danger zone for several planetary boundaries, including climate change and loss of biodiversity in ecosystems. And you would have heard that same week institutions reporting that 14 of the 15 warmest years on record were likely this short century, and the warmest of them all was very likely last year. So there's a fundamental problem, and that is that for most of human history, we've been able to live off the interest of our natural capital, the flows of ecosystem services that provide benefits to us. But we are now rapidly squandering the principle itself, our natural capital itself, the species, the forests, the lakes and rivers. This has massive consequences. We've entered what many scientists consider to be the 6th mass extinction in Earth's history. And depleting our natural capital has real and measurable economic impacts and other impacts to our bottom lines. The TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study, estimated that forest loss alone is already costing the global economy between $2 and $5 trillion a year. So that's nearly a third of the entire U.S. economy, and it's almost certainly an underestimate. Now you would have perhaps noticed that I've been talking about biodiversity and and species and the value that ecosystems have for people almost interchangeably. That's something that at CI we take for granted, I think, but has actually been a source of contention in the conservation community for a number of years now. And I think it's gotten to a point in recent years where there's this really false dichotomy between should we be conserving nature because we value species and the intrinsic value of biodiversity for its own right, or should we be conserving nature because people depend on it? And I think this is one of the most monumental and least productive false dichotomies in history. But I was very glad to see that Heather Tallis, Jane Luchenko, and I think 238 co-signers on this paper in Science there, but I think it was Nature. Just last year, basically destroyed these arguments and said we need a unified and diverse conservation ethic that recognizes and accepts all values of nature from intrinsic to instrumental. I think this is a tremendous move in the right direction, and hope we can sort of move beyond the unnecessary acrimony. Will there be trade-offs and many debates and discussions that need to be had about when and where one value is more important than another, or how they weigh off against each other? Absolutely. But discarding one or the other whole cloth, I think, has not made much sense. So assuming that we're free to think about all of the many reasons why nature should exist, what does a world look like in which we really conserve nature? There are lots of ways that we can think about that, but one that I think, that I like to think about that I think can help frame this is a fairly basic question. How much nature do we need? What should a global goal for conserving nature look like? Well, this has been thought about a little. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is one of the UN conventions emerging from the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, along with the Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and several of the other environmental conventions, in 2010 established what were called the Aichi targets. And one of the most notable of them is Aichi Target 11, which says by 2020 we should conserve 17% of Earth's land area and 10% of our oceans and then various adjectives around it, but basically in protected areas. And for their importance for biodiversity ecosystem services. Many viewed this as a great statement because it raised our goals from what had been lower percent targets. I think the previous terrestrial target was only 10%, raising it to 17%. Okay, that's a great improvement. But what does that really mean, and where do those numbers come from? Personally, I think you'll find through this talk I view these numbers as fairly low. I think there's a lot of interesting questions to ask about that. But just for reference, 17% of land is about the area of North America, including Canada, US, and Mexico. And 10% of marine areas is about half the Atlantic Ocean. So we took a look at this and asked, well, what are the reasons for which, what are some of the basic biodiversity and ecosystem services, and let's just do some back-of-the-envelope calculations to figure out terrestrially whether this makes sense. So if we look at percent of land area and stick in the CBD Aichi target 11 of 17% there, then we ask, well, how much is protected already? So at the time that these targets were generated, that was about 12.9% of terrestrial area. It's since gone up, which is a great thing. It's probably closer to 15% now. We might even get to 17 by 2020. So the areas that are already protected include many places that are very important for biodiversity, but they omit many places that are currently unprotected or may be protected, but are nonetheless very important for biodiversity. So we know these as places identified as important bird areas, key biodiversity areas, IVAs, KVAs, and some other places that have been targeted as some of the last places on Earth where you can find species, threatened species in particular. If they're not protected in these places, they have a very high risk of extinction. So this is sort of some of the basic elements of biodiversity that are in danger of being lost if we don't protect them. It turns out that if you add those unprotected areas important for biodiversity, that gets you to exactly 17%. Beyond that, I think many would argue that there are important ecosystems and other elements of biodiversity that are important that need to be accounted for. That would increase this more. But even this sort of bare minimum of biodiversity already gets us that far. Climate change, very enormous challenge. Forests and other ecosystems play a substantial role in storing and securing and sequestering carbon. Target for some additional area that's needed to, the minimum additional area needed to secure between 70 and 90% of the carbon in ecosystems adds another 7 to 14%. So we haven't even gotten to a range of other ecosystem services, and we're already at 30-31% of terrestrial part of the globe needs to be protected. And then, of course, other ecosystem services. We don't just, not just biodiversity and climate, but there's fresh water, there's food supplies, crop pollination, protection of coastal areas, and others. And some of those are likely to be included within the area that we've accounted for down here, but there are many unprotected areas. So it remains unknown at this point what the number really is, but suffice it to say that if the world was left with only 17% of natural ecosystems intact, we would all be in a lot of trouble. So what are some of the conclusions of that? One, that the 17% target is enough. We need more than that. Two is the fact that these discussions that have resulted in this 17 and 10%, these targets, have largely been politically motivated, or motivated based on what's feasible, or how much we can push governments or policymakers to agree to this time. And there hasn't been a really intelligent discussion about what the science-based targets would actually look like. Another observation is that many of the protected areas that we've got so far are based on the same kind of opportunistic or feasibility type thinking, sort of remote areas, some targeting for biodiversity, but even the protected areas that we have got haven't been ideally targeted for the right set of areas if we're looking at value for biodiversity or for the benefits that people depend on. And then finally, the observation that all of these discussions have been based around the sort of political feasibility and sometimes biodiversity, but rarely has the question of what additional areas are actually needed for that humans depend on. Rarely has that entered the conversation, so that's another limitation. So what would it look like to look into science-based targets, or targets that start to take into account the many needs that humans have for ecosystems? So we're off to a great start. We're able to do this analysis of biodiversity. So it should be fairly easy, right? Well, no, that was the back of the envelope, and it's got a lot of work to do. And we didn't even really set a target for carbon. We just picked some fairly arbitrary values. It gets even harder for other things. What about fresh water? As we know, fresh water flows from watersheds, and forests and wetlands upstream in those watersheds help with both the timing and quality of freshwater flows. So how do we account for how much of those watersheds are needed, either in a given place, let alone a country or a continent or the globe? We're talking about these things in general terms in the language of the Commission on Biodiversity, but the science and the actual quantitative information or maps to really inform decisions isn't there. So it's time for a confession. I don't know the answer to this question. You might have seen that coming. But it's an important question, so let's explore some of the other ways that science can inform it. So let's zoom back out. If we're saying that nature is important for a variety of reasons, where would we start? Well, what are the things that people need? So rather than, this is an exercise that we've gone through at Conservation International, as we're thinking about our own strategy as well. Rather than coming up with our own ideas about what global problems are, let's listen to what the international and global community is discussing and debating. And one place where many of those issues comes together is in the evolving Sustainable Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals, which expire this year, were a set of 10 goals on things like reducing and eliminating poverty, promoting justice and equality, a set of development goals for the world. They, once established, they actually informed a great deal of policy, were very influential. But when the time has sort of expired on them, and you've heard of maybe the post-2015 agenda, it's what comes next as a successor to the Millennium Development Goals. And two, there were some limitations that were recognized in the Millennium Development Goals. One that's very relevant for this conversation is that in the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, there was Goal 7, which was basically ecosystems. And it was the environment sort of isolated as its own goal and not incorporated into any of the other goals. But if it's true that many of the other goals, such as poverty alleviation or climate or things like that, depend on nature, then we should be thinking about those interactions. So we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the current instance, there's the Open Working Group has proposed a set of 17 goals that's going to go to the UN General Assembly in September of 2015, after which there will be negotiation and agreement on goals, followed by specific targets within those, and then indicators and plans for implementation at the national level. Again, it's likely to be very influential, but at this point it's a good place to look for guidance on the major global challenges. If you look across them, you have things like poverty, so ending extreme poverty everywhere, food security, health, education, freshwater security for all, clean energy for all. And then you have 14 and 15 are oceans and terrestrial ecosystems. But in the text of the goals, you actually see language that is connecting among the goals sometimes. So you see the role of nature coming into the freshwater goal, for example. Water-related ecosystems is part of the text of the water goal. So what we did at CI is we took a look at these and we said, well, for each of these challenges, how do we address them? If every institution, every individual, every government was purely goal-driven, we might adopt a set of goals and then aim to achieve those by any means necessary. But if every institution did that, you might not get a very diverse set of approaches to solving them. It'd be a bit like having a toolbox full of nothing but hammers. So it's an interesting thing for me in thinking about CI as an institution. We are in this interesting space of having these goals that overlap with these human sustainable development goals, but recognizing that we're a particular type of tool. I don't know if we're a drill or saw or whatever we are, but the tool is the conservation of nature and the many actions and mechanisms by which we can ensure that natural ecosystems remain standing. And we are able to apply, or we are interested in applying that tool for the betterment of sustainable development. Which raises a logical question of these 17 goals, what's the nexus, or what's the connection of these to nature and conservation of nature? Well, if you look across them, there are things like education, and while I would love to spend a week talking about the connections between nature and education, there are certain goals for which the connection is much stronger and more apparent. So what we did was we looked at some of these key ones: so climate, fresh water, food security, poverty alleviation, energy, and then ecosystems, or the Earth system security itself. And so we're listening to these global challenges, but then we're asking, what is the nature-based component of them? So for example, for climate, reducing the sort of overall goal for climate mitigation might be avoiding dangerous climate change. A nature-based component of it might be to reduce or eliminate the greenhouse gas emissions from ecosystem loss. And so walking back out through this and figuring out what the ecosystem-based components are. And a really interesting thing happens here, because anytime you do an exercise like this, setting your sights on your goals and asking what you're actually going to contribute to them, even if it's something audacious like a global impact, it forces you to test your assumptions and to explicitly state how you're going to have impact. And you can't do that without evidence. I think we're implicitly often making these claims that there are these links, and you see in the CBD text and many other places these links without really it being backed up by solid evidence. So an enormously important role for science is to develop that evidence. Where are the links, and where are there an absence of links, or even oppositional kinds of behaviors? So let's take a look at a couple. Climate change is one that people like to start with. So what's the relationship between nature and climate mitigation? Well, it turns out that there's actually more carbon in the forests on planet Earth than there is in the atmosphere, which to me is a staggering statistic. If we don't keep those forests standing, we're likely to fail in addressing climate change. Now, rate of forest loss, maybe it's just less than a percentage a year worldwide. Is it really going to add up to a lot? Currently, it's about 10 or 11% of emissions. But if you think about slightly longer time scales, we tend to think in very narrow time scales, like the next election cycle or the next quarterly report or something like that. But you don't have to get a lot longer than that to realize the kind of impact that we can have. So here's a map of forest in Borneo. Forest is the green stuff, unfortunately. And in 1950, Borneo was almost entirely covered by tropical rainforest. And in a very short period of time, largely between 1985 and the current day, a staggering fraction of the entire island of Borneo's forest was lost. So if you think about that in the context of adding another 2 billion people to the planet and the shift in the way that people behave in the next few decades, it's not that far-fetched that we could lose a very substantial portion of it if we don't figure out how to tackle the problem. As Steve Bacala and Rob Sokolow here noted in a seminal contribution in this area a while back with the stabilization wedges approach, the maintenance of carbon stored within forests in particular is an important part of solving the climate problem. It's not the only solution, but it represents a significant fraction of it. And more recently, people have looked at this in different terms. One is what part of the problem is tropical deforestation? And people used to say it's a fifth, and that number's actually come down because we have better data on forests, and unfortunately other kinds of emissions have gone up. But it's still 10, 11%, perhaps up to 13% if you're factoring in all the soils and things like that. Which is as much as all planes, cars, trucks on the planet combined. So this is significant. But beyond that, trees not only store carbon, but they sequester carbon. They draw in carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And I'm an engineer and an optimist, and as both of those things, I like to think that at some point in the next couple of decades, we're going to have an effective technology for removing carbon that's already in the atmosphere. But we are not there yet. The only technology we have for doing that at scale right now is natural ecosystems. So if you consider that, forests are not only 10%, 11% of the problem, but they are an additional much larger percent of the solution because they're the only tools we have that act that way. So if you add those together, it's perhaps 24 to 30% of the global solution, the sequestration component. So we have a lot to learn, obviously, about the relationship of nature and Earth's climate, between nature and Earth's climate. But science like this is absolutely essential to guiding policies that help use nature as a part of the solution to addressing climate change. So let's talk about, as climate, let's talk about another one, poverty, which is often the central framing of the both the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, many national development plans. So there's been a lot of work done on the relationship of conservation or between nature and poverty, but not much at a global scale that really asks what's the global interaction, the global potential here. So we started trying to answer that question or get some insights into this relationship at a global scale. So to start with, we need to estimate the value of ecosystems in terms of the services that they provide to people, which is not an easy thing to do at scale. And you can't do detailed valuations everywhere. So you have to find ways to estimate. So we take a database of any of the hundreds of valuation studies that have been done, and we calculate things like the value of different ecosystems for each of a variety of services. So the value of forests for water regulation, the value of woodlands for pollination services, and things like that. Put those in common units of dollars per hectare per year, and then extrapolate that from that known data to the places where we don't have data. Obviously, that sort of paint by numbers approach involves some fairly substantial assumptions since the estimation technique. So one of the criticisms of this approach, this is called benefits transfer. One of the criticisms is that it assumes that conditions are the same everywhere, which they aren't. What it's really estimating is sort of the potential ecosystem service value, the value of services provided by ecosystems at a given point, assuming that people are able to realize those services the same way that the people that were at the places that were in that database evaluation studies did. That looks like this. And if you think about it, there's actually some value in having estimates of what the potential looks like, independent of how people might use those. But for exploring the relationship to poverty, we're actually interested in just those benefits that flow to poor communities. So we can get a more accurate picture by applying some modeling on top of this that accounts for where people are and whether they're in a position to realize those services in the socioeconomic context they're in. And so if we just look at the relationship, if we look at mapping ecosystems and the benefits they provide to people generally, not poverty yet, but accounting for where people are, this is what we get. You can see a couple of fairly significant differences. So for example, there are a lot of at high northern latitudes, there are a lot of freshwater services, potential services that are sort of flowing into the ocean. There's not a lot of people around deriving benefit from those. Similarly, there's a lot of freshwater in the Amazon, but it's quite surplus in relative terms compared to the number of people there or the context elsewhere. So you see a decline in northern latitudes, you see a decline in places like the Amazon, northern Europe. And then if we do the same thing, but we factor in poverty, you see further changes. So the developed countries disappear except for the places where there are ecosystems that are flowing downstream into developing countries with greater poverty by global standards. And this is what we're really interested in. So what's the connection of this to nature, or what we think of as nature conservation priorities? So what we did was compare that to a map of where what biodiversity conservation priorities would be. And so the red areas on this one are the greatest priorities based on the presence of threatened and endemic species. And a really interesting thing happens as you look at these different ways of estimating ecosystem services and how they compare to biodiversity. So one way to think, we're basically comparing these maps and the distributions of these values. So one way to think about that is, if we were to take the top 25% of Earth's land area in terms of biodiversity conservation priority and ask how much of the ecosystem service value is coming from those areas, you would expect that if the two were completely unassociated with each other, if it was random, you would expect that 25% of the ecosystem service value would be coming from those places. It turns out that the potential ecosystem service value, it's nearly 40%. But something interesting happens, which is that as you increasingly look at where people are needing these benefits from ecosystems, you get an even stronger correlation. So 25% of Earth's land area providing nearly twice that in terms of the ecosystem service value. And it's even greater when you think about ecosystems that poor people depend on. And there's a lot of really interesting things going on here. One, you've got almost latitudinal gradients in both species diversity and population density in some cases, and certainly in poverty. A lot of poverty is in tropical developing countries. You've also got factors going on here like the ecosystems that are most important for threatened species. One significant component of that is high altitude mountain ranges where you have isolated populations. Those also happen to be in many geographies, places that are important for providing ecosystem services, flows of fresh water downstream to human populations. So there's a lot of fascinating things going on here. But one of the sort of take-homes is that there's actually quite a bit of connection between the places that are most important for biodiversity conservation and the places that are most important for supporting poor communities. Now, one thing that you might say is, well, this is these ecosystems are always there, but they're still poor. What's going on there? Which is completely valid. But I think the comparison is if these ecosystems weren't there, they would actually be worse off, for one thing. For another, if you think about an inclusive wealth perspective, this is actually part of their inclusive wealth. And the third thing is that this has the potential, being poor communities, poor countries, being the stewards of natural capital that is important for other people, is at least the initial basis for developing mechanisms that compensate them for keeping those forests standing, those ecosystems standing. This is what, fundamentally, RED is a big payments for ecosystem services scheme like that, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation as a climate mechanism. Payments for watershed service is another kind of thing. So it might not be directly alleviating poverty right now. It's preventing it from getting worse. It's providing safety nets, and it's potentially, at least, the basis for doing some substantial improvements in the future. Let's zoom down to a much finer scale and bracket this. In Tanzania, we've done work, for example, with smallholder farmers and asked, okay, the total services that this community gets from ecosystems, how does that compare? Is this just a drop in a bucket? What we actually found was that the value of ecosystem services, water, firewood, and a variety of other things, was actually greater than the amount of revenue that they earned from selling cash crops. And that's excluding, that's an underestimate, because it's excluding the ecosystem services that actually support the production of those cash crops. So this isn't just a drop in the bucket. There's actually a meaningful relationship between ecosystems and sustaining the livelihoods and lives of poor communities. So we looked at climate, we looked at poverty, and this is sort of an evidence and gathering of evidence and a synthesis kind of approach to understanding what the links are here. And there's a set of these issues, such as poverty, human health is another one, climate mitigation, but there's actually getting some good review and synthesis done, where you've got a fairly clear picture emerging of the nexus between these things. But there's another set where it's more scattered. So for example, at the top right, that's one paper that's sort of representative of a body of work looking at the relationship of, in the sort of energy space, energy is another one of the Sustainable Development Goals, the relationship of ecosystems and their role in supporting energy production, specifically with hydropower. But there's no general synthesis on the nexus of nature and energy, for example. I think that's something that's lacking and would be really interesting to see. Food production is another one. Obviously, a lot of work on the relationship of food production and nature, but it's in sort of these different compartments. Like, this is a good sort of synthesis article, review article on meta-analysis actually on pollination, but broadly speaking, the interface between ecosystems and food. So there's some good work that's been done. There's great sort of underlying work, but the synthesis is still lacking. So that's another sort of big science need. And I think that's important because sometimes you hear people say, about environmental problems, we have all the science we need. It's just a matter of policy. I don't agree with that. We need to understand the way the physical world works, but communicate that. Collect and deliver the data. We need to understand where nature connects with various people's bottom lines and where it doesn't. We need to understand what changes we need to see in human behaviors and design policies that incentivize people to make those changes. That's science, that's engineering, that's economics, that's social science, and it's how all those inform policy. And that's a reason why I think this program in particular is so exciting and so important, because it brings those people, those disciplines together. So we've talked a bit about understanding evidence. Synthetic global analysis is one way. Another is to systematically map evidence that's already in the literature. So there's a lot of those papers that are out there looking at conservation and human well-being. What we wanted to do was, and this is just laying out the protocol for it, was to actually look at this systematically. This is an approach that's been used in medicine. Evidence-based medicine has actually, I mean, it might be fair to say, revolutionized the way that evidence is brought to bear in medicine, with enormous improvements in the speed at which trials and tests can result in adoption of the things that work and rejections of the things that don't. If conservation is as important as I like to believe it is, I think we should be trying to apply the same approach and seeing what we can learn. So we started with 35,000 papers meeting our criteria. We went through a set of additional screens to get to about 1,100 papers looking at the relationship of conservation actions to human well-being. These connections between an action, such as direct payment or maintaining an ecosystem, connections between the actions and the human well-being outcomes often follow many different pathways. We tried to provide some kind of synthesis and consolidation of those. And we found some really interesting things when we looked at the survey of the evidence. One, the evidence is concentrated in particular geographies. Temperate forest and tropical forest in particular stand out, but different geographies and biomes are represented. The types of studies, in particular the way that human well-being was assessed, varies greatly. It's almost exclusively surveys, and you almost never have experimental or even quasi-experimental design. Quasi-experimental is post hoc establishing what your controls were. Type and frequency of initiatives, almost all of them, well, a significant fraction of them were protected areas and management thereof, very little on many other kinds of approaches. And the type and frequency of measures of human well-being, the dominant one there is economic. Physical health right under it has very few studies addressing it. So encouraging that there's a lot of evidence out there, discouraging a bit that it's difficult to, when you look across it all, to represent all the cases we might be interested in. And another interesting thing that comes up is that it's not always positive, and you might think about that. You can have positive impact, but you can also have negative impact. So you can have ecosystem disservices. So, protecting elephants, if the elephants are coming and raiding your crops, which happens and people die, that's negative impact. Nature isn't universally always good for people in every single context. You can also have negative impacts of conservation actions. So you create a protected area, you exclude people from using those resources that may have been the place where they lived before. Obviously, there's elements of bad human well-being outcomes going on there. And if you sort of compile this across a range of actions and a range of human well-being outcomes, just at the first glance, the reds are the ones where there was some kind of negative impact. So clearly there's a mixed case here. I should emphasize that this wasn't a detailed systematic review where we tried to do some kind of quantitative meta-analysis to extract the actual strengths of these relationships, but simply mapping of the evidence. So what can we conclude from that? One, it's a lot of work. Yes, we need to do more to fill in the gaps, but it's not going to solve everything. Even the amount of work that we put into this, didn't answer all the questions we were hoping. And another thing that comes up is the difference between this red and blue there is that you have a disconnect between the benefits and costs of conserving nature. And this is to me, one of the central challenges and one of the central needs for really creative thinking in conservation. And that's that those that benefit from nature are often not the same people, same communities, sometimes even the same nations as those that are incurring the costs of conserving it. They're often not in the same place, and often not even at the same time. You might incur the cost of conserving nature now, and the benefit might not be realized for several years. And those are serious challenges and hurdles that we need to overcome. And the way we do that is by coming up with mechanisms that can negotiate those trade-offs. Payments for ecosystem services, which I mentioned, is one of those. So, how much nature do we need? It's an important question. It's possible to address. We're doing some. We need to do much more. There's a big need for science. How well are we actually doing in protecting so far? So Mark Mulligan and some others have been looking at this question. If we can get some insights, I showed you earlier this benefits transfer approach to mapping ecosystem services. He's got a more mechanistic model that he's done, and he's actually able to run it at a global scale. So this is an alternative way of getting at it. And if we ask the question, we're using Africa as an example here. If we take a look at the area that's protected, and we can see the evolution of the protected area system over time. This is the total area of parks, going from 6% in 1950 to over 20% in Africa today. Again, if the things we're after, biodiversity, species, ecosystem services, are random with respect to parks, you'd expect them to just sort of track that line. So how do we do? Good news. Potential freshwater services, biodiversity, we're doing as good as random. So that's, given that parks weren't targeting these things to begin with often, that's not a terrible result. We would like it to be better, but it's not terrible. This is, though. And this is really fascinating. And so this gets to what we were talking about, the potential versus realized services earlier, where realized is accounting for, is someone actually there to use that service? Is it where someone needs it to be? Parks in Africa aren't protecting the places that are most important for people. So it's 1 billion people on the continent. They're very widely distributed. Parks in Africa tend to be large, remote, dry areas. So huge implications for how we think about protected areas going forward, or what we do to secure nature going forward. Are we putting them in the right places? Do we abandon what we've done so far? I don't think so, but clearly we need to think, if that's something that we value, we need to think about how we plan protection going forward. I was having a conversation with someone who works in renewable energy, and my question to him was, well, huge changes in cost of solar the last couple of years. What's the biggest change that's caused for you? It must have been massive, the way you think about things. And he said, well, the most interesting thing is that in the renewable space, we used to talk about getting to, how do we get to 5% of the energy mix, and 20% was just a pipe dream. How do we scale up? And now we're talking about how do we get to 50, 60, 70% of energy mix. That's what's changed. And it's not just a matter of replicating the same thing, a dozen more times to scale it up, because there's actual changes in the way you have to behave to get to those scales. So solar and wind are fine for the first tens of percent maybe, but you're not going to get to 60 or 70 with solar when the lights turn off at night, or wind when wind is inconsistent. So you have to come up with new mechanisms for distributing energy, alternative mixes of things. And I was struck by how much that parallels what we're talking about with this how much nature do we need question, and how do we get there? Because protected areas have done great things so far. Monumentally important tool for securing nature, both for biodiversity and for benefits to people. But we're not going to get to, I don't know what the number is, we're not going to get to 40% even, let alone 60% of conserving the nature on this planet with protected areas alone. So what is the mix of things that we need to add? Another component of that is, another way to look at that, is that if you look at the global protected area budget, it's about $5 billion a year. All global, the voluntary sector, philanthropy, overseas development assistance, foreign direct investment is about $500 billion a year. This is where the money is getting spent. These are the dominant economic forces on the planet. Public spending, 15 trillion or so, this is a couple years back. And private sector, it depends on if you're counting derivatives and things, but it's 50 trillion and up. We have to change the way behaviors happen there in order to change the game. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to just skip ahead and sum up here. Actually, I'll just do this. Science. Again, if you look back at the news, there's some ways that science isn't doing right well. So House resolutions on, or House bills, for example, in the EPA Science Advisory Board Reform Act, saying that scientists can't provide guidance on things that they've published papers on because it's a conflict of interest, right? So there's some negative things for science going on right now. I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but it's bad news. But on the other hand, the stuff we're talking about, there's a lot of good news too. So all the stuff about nature and climate. Brazil, in the last 10 years, has cut their deforestation rate by 80%. That's technology that's done that. That's science, that's technology, the ability to understand where deforestation is happening and designing the policies to make that stop. Indonesia, most important place on the planet for a lot of marine biodiversity, huge for sharks, for mantis, for other things. This past year declared their entire EEZ, which is gigantic, a sanctuary for manta rays. They did that because of economics. 400,000 people marched in New York. There's a lot of bad climate news, but there's good climate news also. And this wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the climate science that enables us to understand what's going on. We had dozens of companies and governments signing on to a declaration on forests that involve getting deforestation out of the supply chain because of its role in climate change. That's science. So, probably we need a lot more nature, we need more information. How do we secure it? We need to do it quickly. There are a lot of ways we have to get there, but all of them need to be informed by science and economics and policy. And I would conclude by saying that not only is this stuff important, but I want to know your answers to these questions because I know a lot of you are thinking about these kinds of things and related areas. So I really look forward to talking with you and going from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. Do you want to take your own questions for a few minutes?
Sure, happy to.
So that's very interesting and discouraging. But one aspect that you didn't focus on that I'm interested in your views on, both from a preserving nature perspective as well as from the sustainable development goals, is where is population in this discussion? It seems that if you look at Africa right now, it has less than 1 billion people, projected to go up to over 2.5 billion people. The hope is that they won't be living in abject poverty. They will be able to consume a reasonable amount of subsistence level. How is that going to be reconciled with preserving nature? It seems that part of this conversation is absent that's really critical is a discussion of access to family planning and more explicit discussions of empowering women and reducing population growth rates, especially in places like Africa and the Middle East.
Yes. Population is among the most discouraging issues of all. If you think about the consumption and potential impacts of population increases, I think you already said part of my answer, which is the encouraging news about population is that we know what we can do about it. We know from particular states, particular countries, we've seen empowerment of women, rights, education, transition from agrarian to rural, to urban economies and things like that, access to family planning, education are all able to result in demographic transitions to decreased fertility rates that are much more compatible with sustainability. So technically, we know it's possible. Why didn't I address it in my presentation? I think partly that comes back to the toolbox issue, that if every organization takes on population, then it gets away from our niche and doing other things, and we risk some of the relationships that we've been able to build in order to advise governments on maintenance of natural capital. I know that's not a very satisfying answer because it's clearly an enormous issue, but figuring out some way to coordinate so that even if CI doesn't adopt we're a population organization perspective, we're at least able to work with and make sure that we have the right coalition of organizations and institutions in place to make something change.
So is there any work going on sort of addressing these issues but without being so explicit about it? Or is it really just not being addressed,
We have in many projects in Africa, in particular, over the years, been involved in population-related issues, but it's not a front and center kind of thing for CI. Yeah.
That's a simple question, which is, I don't know if you said it at the beginning, what is the definition of protected areas? You talked about how people tend not to live there. Is that like, are they usually national parks, or are they?
Yeah, fantastic question. Actually, something that's really central to this whole thing about going from protected areas to other approaches. So there's different categories. The IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, has these 6 categories from strict protected areas. Things like a national park, like Yellowstone in the U.S. is a good example of something that nobody lives there. No extractive use is allowed, but it's much more than that. It includes a variety of things on up to places where mineral or extractives exploration is allowed and things like that. But the primary value is in retaining nature. I think the question alludes to what's really needed is that we're only going to get so far with strictly protected areas, and then we're going to have to get into things like managed landscapes where you have the pollinators are in like small fragments or hedgerows around the agricultural plots where those pollinators are most needed. I think there's a danger in thinking about it as either a black or white thing. Like there are some people that say everything needs to be just these integrated landscapes, and that discards the tremendous value of having truly wild places as either the sources of water or the places where endangered species are able to persist. So I think it takes a mix. Yeah.
On the protected area versus the potential ecosystem services value, that graphic you showed for Africa,
yeah.
I guess I'm just a little surprised that it's not doing much better than random protecting this potential value, given that most protected areas, or many protected areas, not only in Africa but elsewhere, are sort of biased to those more rugged areas, which are kind of, by definition, watersheds.
The higher elevation.
Yeah, so what's going on there?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we need to do some more looking into it with the comparison among continents. It's a great question, though. I think, in general, the large, remote, dry areas, it explains part of it. I don't know what the sort of area versus elevation profile looks like for Africa, but I suspect that that's part of it, that somewhere like the Himalayas is enormously important. So in Asia, that's the source of the seven biggest rivers, and you've got 2.5 billion people downstream of that, or I think more. So in Asia, you don't get the same pattern because the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau, which are somewhat protected, those alone account for a lot of it. But in Africa, the needs aren't linked to some very high altitude sources or water towers, for example, and they're much more distributed around the landscape, which the protected areas are not. But that's initial responses to the first look at the data, and we need to do more work on it. Yeah.
Sort of a related question. I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on the idea of the realized ESV for poor people, because I guess I'm particularly interested in this idea of calculating ESV based on where people are located. So, for example, in that calculation, places like the northern tundras of Canada and Greenland don't really seem to have any ESB, realized ESB, and I wonder if that's because we neglect things like the value of permafrost for preventing climate change that predominantly affects poor nations, or basically how that calculation happens to exclude those regions.
Yeah, so there's multiple assumptions built into that. And yes, that, the one you mentioned, was in fact neglected in that calculation. So when we went to the realizer for poor in particular, we actually not only restricted it to just we are poor communities, but we actually dropped some of the services themselves. So we eliminated anything that's not immediately needed by poor communities, on the span of like 3 years. So climate regulation we took out, not because it's not important, but we just wanted to look at sort of the more extreme case to get more insight into it. And there's an additional analysis where we went back and added in not only the climate regulation, which would include some of the issues like we were talking about, but also the potential for red mechanisms or other climate financing mechanisms to actually provide compensation and look at that separately. But I didn't have time to get into that.
Will, I think we'll break it at this point. If folks have other questions, they can approach. Thank you.
Oh,